So good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and Environment teleconference entitled More Harm Than Good, New Science, Legal Actions, and Policy on Oil Spill Dispersants. We're joined today by Claudia Polsky, the founding director of the Environmental Law Clinic at UC Berkeley, as well as Rosemary Ahtuangaruak, an Inupiat scholar, health professional, and former mayor of Nuiqsut. Welcome, both of you, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Nick Reardon, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. For those of you not familiar, CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and Environment, abbreviated CHE. And our aim is to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. So you can find more information. It's available at our website, akaction.org, as well as healthandenvironment.org. I sent a link to Claudia Polsky's presentation slides along with the dial-up instructions it was yesterday evening for me, but we've got callers from as far away as Italy, so the exact dateline comparison there is left to interpretation. But you can also find a link to her presentation slides by going to www.akaction.org and clicking on the title of today's call, and there's a link to those slides. As usual, this is an audio-only teleconference, not a webinar, so you'll need to click through the slides yourself once you've downloaded them and follow along. Our call will be 1 hour long, and we'll reserve some time after the speakers to invite questions from the listeners. The timing of this call, the timing of this call is inspired in part by April being the 10-year anniversary of the oil spill from British Petroleum's Deepwater Horizon oil rig. We're not too far off from an anniversary for the Exxon Valdez as well, which occurred in March, but as well as the recent legal action brought against the EPA to compel stricter regulation of chemical dispersants used during these and many other oil spills. So without further ado, welcome again. We are delighted to have you both on our call today. And Ms. Polsky, you may go ahead and begin when ready.
Thank you so much, Nick. Good morning, everybody. I am delighted to be here, and thanks to ACAT for inviting me. It is, as Nick said, very fitting to be here in late April of 2020, which marks both the 50th anniversary of Earth Day and the 10th memorial of the BP Deepwater Horizon well blowout, which was the biggest oil disaster in U.S. history. Some of the media described it as the anniversary of that event, but our clients much prefer the more fitting term memorial. This month is also when the Environmental Law Clinic that I direct at UC Berkeley School of Law is involved in a flurry of briefing related to our national plan for oil spill cleanup, and that is taking place in federal district court in San Francisco. The point of our lawsuit is to force the U.S. EPA to radically rethink how we respond to oil spills that, of course, inevitably accompany drilling and transport of oil offshore. It's a response that's currently governed by a planning process that relies very heavily on toxic chemicals to disperse oil without really cleaning it up. And in this litigation effort, we represent as plaintiffs my co-panelist today, Rosemary, this webinar's host organization, Alaska Community Action on Toxics, and several other plaintiffs whom I'll describe in a few moments. Next slide. But before I do that, I want to say a few words about our Environmental Law Clinic and to thank the 5 students you see pictured who've worked incredibly hard on this case to date. They'd all be here today, except that 4 of them are in exams and 1 has graduated. So litigation takes a long time and students come and go during its pendency. Our clinic exists to train law students to be competent legal practitioners and to provide a bridge between their classroom learning and their future as lawyers. And we do this by giving them opportunities to work in intensively supervised ways on real-life matters for live clients. And in choosing which matters and clients those would be when I was setting up this clinic 5 years ago, I chose to focus our clinic quite deliberately on the related areas of environmental health and environmental justice, essentially the environmental domains where environmental harms affect people. And I did that because these seemed to me areas where additional legal capacity was greatly needed to supplement and support all of the good work being done by community organizers on the political front and the work of scientific and technical experts. And so in our clinic, we have a lot of cases related to chemical exposures to people, and this is one of them. The one last point I want to make about our clinic is that a secondary goal is to make the environmental law field more diverse. If you look at this slide, you'll see that 3 out of the 5 students working on this project are women, and 3 out of the 5 are people of color. Some are also first-generation professionals, and all of them did an extraordinary job. Next slide. So in just a couple minutes, I want to talk about the history of our oil dependence and spill response. Earth Day was marked last week by a lot of press coverage around its 50th anniversary, and there was a lot of discussion of the federal blockbuster statutes that day helped to spawn. As most of you surely know, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and importantly for today, the Clean Water Act were all passed by Congress in the few years following Earth Day, and they were all responsive to its message. Now, people mostly know the Clean Water Act because it's what essentially turned sewers back into rivers by regulating point source discharges from factories and other polluting facilities. But the Clean Water Act has a lot of different facets, and one of the more obscure portions of it is called the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Pollution Contingency Plan, or the National Contingency Plan, or as we're going to call it for short today, the NCP. And this is essentially what we do when things go wrong with oil and hazardous substances. It's our blueprint for how the nation will respond to oil spills that occur on the water, and it's implemented by various regional and local bodies and by first responders like Coast Guard workers who arrive when oil has spilled on the ocean. So, as a brief aside, we could, of course, imagine an alternate future where when the Arab oil embargo happened shortly after the Clean Water Act's enactment, the nation said, oh, maybe it's not such a great idea to be so dependent on large tankers of oil from unstable foreign nations, and we could avoid oil wars and a lot of environmental damage by rethinking America's energy trajectory. However, that future did not come to pass. We are now still a heavily oil-dependent nation. We're locked into an oil and gas economy with all of its associated environmental risks. So we can at least try to manage those risks responsibly. So the National Contingency Plan, this NCP, contemplates not simply containing spilled oil with large mechanical booms and then sucking it up or scooping it from the ocean's surface. It instead contemplates and expressly permits the large-scale use of chemicals to disperse spilled oil. And these chemicals are identified on something called the product schedule, which EPA prepares under its Clean Water Act regulations. The dispersants are used with some frequency in response to small oil spills, but it's really their large-scale use in response to catastrophic spills that concerns our plaintiffs. In the Exxon Valdez spill, where 11 million gallons of oil were used, a very large amount of dispersant chemicals were used. I believe the quantity is not known precisely, and perhaps someone on the call can correct me on that in the Q&A. But we certainly know that when the BP Deepwater Horizon spill occurred decades later, there were 2 million gallons of dispersant chemicals used in response to that oil spill, an extraordinary volume. Next slide. So what are these chemicals that we're pouring on top of spilled oil on the ocean? Dispersants, as they're known, are both solvents and surfactants. And what that means is that being solvents, they dissolve things. surfactants are things that act on a surface to change the physical behavior of chemicals. And so here what dispersants do is they break oil into small droplets by reducing the surface tension that holds the molecules of oil together. And what that does is create a rapid visual improvement. You no longer see a huge dark eyesore to which TV cameras flock and embarrass your oil company. So in that sense, they're very effective public relations chemicals. It makes it look like the oil has just vanished. And to be fair, it seems that these dispersants can benefit some creatures, for example, seabirds, in that they might prevent seabirds from getting completely encased in oil. Those hideous photos you see of oily birds. But these dispersant chemicals also make a lot of things worse. Specifically, they make it much easier for marine organisms to ingest spilled oil, because if you're a fish, these now very small droplets of oil look like food. They make it much easier for oil to sink into the water column and ultimately settle on the ocean floor, where it smothers benthic organisms and reefs and becomes impossible to remove. And most important, and this is really what's relevant to the litigation I'll talk about today, dispersants get into and onto the bodies of first responders and people in coastal communities near oil spills, and they do a lot of harm. How do they do that? Well, the primary routes of exposure are inhalation. These dispersants are aerially sprayed, just like how you imagine a lot of pesticides being applied in a crop duster. And people get exposed dermally to an oil and dispersant mixture. For example, where oil washes ashore and people walk barefoot on the beach, their skin often becomes blistered from the combination of oil and dispersants. And oil and dispersants are independently very toxic to living organisms, including humans. Oil has volatile organic compounds and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, so those are associated, of course, with respiratory and cancer effects. And then two of the primary dispersants that are used in oil spill response include the chemicals propylene glycol and 2-butoxyethanol, which have been linked to respiratory irritation and which have also been observed in animal studies to cause cell death in the airway. And the combination of these chemicals is more toxic than either alone, and here's why. The exact mechanism by which dispersants cause oil to break up is essentially their ability to dissolve fats. Oils are of course, fats. And it's the fatty layer in human skin that acts to protect our internal organisms from the environment, that makes a lot literally roll off our skin. And so dispersants essentially act as penetrants. They make it possible for the oil to enter the human body through the skin by destroying this fatty protective layer. And in humans, these cause all sorts of nasty effects. They cause mutations in cells, they adversely affect fetuses, and they cause red blood cells to rupture. That's what hemolysis means in this slide. Okay, next slide. These are just a few admittedly disturbing visuals from our client, Dr. Ricky Ott, who is a marine toxicologist and the lead plaintiff in our litigation. And they show some of the types of effects of this oil and dispersant combination. I will admit, and it's tricky, that it's very hard to disentangle the effects of oil from the effects of chemical dispersants on people because they exist together in the settings where people are exposed. I will say there's one very good Coast Guard study out there which looked at both Coast Guard responders who were exposed to oil and those who were exposed also to dispersants, and it seemed to find a very strong relationship between exposure to a mixture that contained dispersants and acute respiratory symptoms. And of course, the article concluded with my pet peeve, which is right after saying we found this very strong relationship. It said, future prospective studies will be needed to confirm these findings. Of course, that's what you say when you want to keep grant money flowing so you can do another more refined study. What would be really nice is if authors of peer-reviewed pieces about environmental harms also said, but we know enough now to take precautionary action. That is certainly the state of the science. We don't know everything we'd like to know, but we know enough to know that dispersants should not be used on a broad scale, at least not dispersants with the current chemical composition. But the science isn't directly on trial in our case, as I will now explain. So next slide shows you our petitioners and plaintiffs. The lawsuit that we have brought is a lawsuit that directly challenges the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, for failing to update our national contingency plan for oil spill response so that it reflects all the lessons that we learned from the harms of dispersant use in response to the Exxon Valdez disaster and the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. The last time the NCP was updated was 1994, so just a little bit after Exxon Valdez and before long-term studies of its effects had been done, and of course way before BP Deepwater Horizon. This is a quarter-century-old plan that, according to the Clean Water Act, is supposed to reflect contemporary scientific and technical knowledge. Obviously, it does not do that. What happened when EPA kept failing to update this national contingency plan was that many of our plaintiffs here formally petitioned EPA to update the plan. They filed a big petition in 2012. EPA didn't do anything. They refiled a petition in 2014. And the then Obama administration finally said, okay, we're going to update this plan. You're right, it's dangerously out of date. And they published a proposed rule that was better than what exists, not perfect in our plaintiff's eyes, but better. Mm-hmm. And then the administration changed, and then nothing happened. And then more nothing happened. And then nothing kept on happening until a point at which we were 5 years beyond the date when the rule was first proposed, and we're now 8 years beyond when our clients first petitioned EPA to update the plan. So working with this whole group of individuals and organizations that are adversely affected by the ongoing use of toxic dispersants, we decided to go to court and try to force EPA to complete this rulemaking, to issue a new NCP that was much more environmentally and health protective. And under the Clean Water Act, if you want to bring a lawsuit, let's go to the next slide, which should say Notice of Intent to Sue. Under the Clean Water Act, you have to give the federal government notice if you want to sue it as citizens. And the idea here is that you're giving it time to conform its conduct to the law and avoid the wastefulness and expense of a lawsuit for everyone. Well, we filed this notice last March, and EPA proceeded to do more nothing. And then we added an additional plaintiff over the summer, and so we filed a new notice with our expanded group of plaintiffs in the fall, giving EPA one last chance to do the right thing, and EPA did more nothing. And so early in 2020, we filed a lawsuit. A couple things here I want to say about doing media in concert with this court filing. When we issued our Notice of Intent to Sue, which is very preliminary, it's not even formally initiating a lawsuit, it's just saying, we may do this if you don't behave. We did a really, really big media push to tell the story of this case, and each of our plaintiffs, like Rosemary, who've suffered enormous harm and observed enormous harm from the use of dispersants in oil spill response. And this is kind of coming back to the teaching function of our clinic. We always tell our students, you know, you can win in court, but if you're not simultaneously educating people about your issue through the media and working with community organizers to create a broad base of support and political pressure, your victory will be very fragile and it will not endure. And so in parallel with winning favorable court rulings, we are always working to win hearts and minds by working with a variety of partners and putting our message out in the media. Next slide. So we worked on our media campaign with the former National Director of Media for the American Civil Liberties Union. We got a staggering amount of media. We got an exclusive story in the Washington Post that told the story of dispersant harms more thoroughly than had ever been done in the mainstream media. It was just a beautiful piece. We got coverage in indigenous press like the Alaska Native News. We got coverage in local media markets like the Anchorage Daily News. And then one of the things that made me happiest, we got an op-ed published in The Guardian that was co-written by one of our students and one of our clients. Next slide. When we filed our lawsuit, we did a little more media, but I think we had super saturated the market the first time, and so we got limited uptake when we filed our formal complaint in federal court. But we did get some relevant media coverage, in particular in the trade press that people read on Capitol Hill, and that led us to get inquiries from the House of Representatives, where there was interest in doing an oversight hearing of EPA and its totally inadequate planning for future oil spills as we open 90% of the U.S. coast to drilling. Now, Corona disrupted the plans for that hearing, as it has with so many other things, but that is something I expect to see once life gets a little bit back to normal. Next slide. So our lawsuit has two basic legal claims. In some ways, it's a very simple lawsuit, which does not mean that it's simple to win. The first claim is that under the Clean Water Act, EPA has a mandatory duty to have an up-to-date contingency plan. We know that if we drill, we're going to spill, and we need to have a plan that reflects current science and technology. That sounds very straightforward, but actually the Clean Water Act, like many statutes, is not written as clearly on this point as one would like. The language is quite squishy. It says that the executive shall prepare and publish a national contingency plan, and that it should be efficient and effective, and that it should reflect current science and technology. But then it says that the executive may, from time to time, as the president deems advisable, revise or otherwise amend the plan. Now, that may and from time to time language is all a little squishy when we're trying to say you have a mandatory duty. But without going too much into the legal details, because I know we're time constrained, I will just say that we actually have very strong precedent in the judicial circuit in which we find ourselves, which is the Ninth Circuit, for the fact that even where Congress says may, sometimes it means shall. And in a particular case that's quite analogous to ours in 2017, a case called In Re Community Voice, the Ninth Circuit held that EPA had a mandatory duty to update very outmoded and therefore health dangerous standards for lead paint and dust, where the relevant statute said that EPA essentially may update those standards from time to time. The court said this is so obviously urgent, this is so obviously warranted by existing standard that really turns into a mandatory duty. And we have strong evidence of what Congress intended from where the relevant provisions are placed in the Clean Water Act. And then just last week, we got a nice gift from the U.S. Supreme Court when in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court said on a different Clean Water Act issue, you can't read the words of the statute quite so literally. You have to look at what Congress was trying to do in the 1970s, which was make sure that all of our national waters were fishable and swimmable and clean. And so we are feeling pretty good about that claim, which will be the subject of a court hearing next week. And then the claim on which, knock on everything, I think we just have to win is a separate legal claim for so-called unreasonable delay. The Administrative Procedure Act, which applies broadly to federal agencies, not just EPA, not just this rulemaking, says an agency cannot be unreasonable in finishing up a rulemaking or some other activity it's undertaken. And here, as I said, it's been 5 years with a rule that is pending in the proposed stage. It's time to make it final. And so that's a very strong claim. In addition to having this hearing on the Clean Water Act claim, we have a hearing the week after on a motion to intervene by the American Petroleum Institute. The API is afraid that even the Trump Environmental Protection Agency will not sufficiently vigorously defend the rights of oil companies to make money from offshore drilling and will regulate them too stringently. So that'll be a really interesting hearing. So we're happy to keep everyone posted on what happens in those hearings, although the final merits of our case will not really be decided until probably the fall. These are all kind of preliminary skirmishes, and the bigger battle comes later. The last thing I want to say is that even if we win on everything, the most we can get out of this specific lawsuit is a court order that requires the Environmental Protection Agency to finalize a rule to update and improve the NCP by some certain date, probably a date that's about 6 or 12 months out from when the court rules. And so that's a lot better than what we have, but it is a lot less than what we want. And so I think that's kind of something we've had to emphasize a lot to our students, that there's often a big gap between what justice looks like and what the law can deliver. And it's likewise a conversation that we're constantly having with our clients, for whom getting a final rule in this specific proceeding is just a tiny piece of the change that they want to see in how oil and gas are managed and ideally ultimately phased out in our U.S. energy economy. So it has been an incredible pleasure and privilege to learn from Rosemary in this case about what oil and gas dependence and toxic dispersant use really mean on the ground for Alaska's most vulnerable populations, including its native populations, and also to hear about their resilience and tenacity and organizing for a different and saner future. So with that, I thank you all for your interest and attention, and I turn it over to Rosemary.
Hi, this is Rosemary. I'm glad I got through. We actually are on the road because of some of these issues, but thank you for everything. I know I haven't heard all that's been engaged. I've only been on for a few minutes, but I live in the village of Nuiqsut, and I work on these issues because I attend our local community meetings. I became interested because as a local community health aide in our villages, we don't have doctors. I started seeing respiratory concerns. With the increased oil and gas development, more and more people had respiratory concerns. At the same time, there was lots of development that was affecting our lands and waters, and it was affecting the way that our animals live in our lands and waters and how we interact with our animals. So things such as the loud seismic boom was disrupting migratory patterns as our bowhead whale hunt. And you listen to people as they suffer through these changes. All of a sudden, now the caribou are many miles away. The whale strikes go from being just 2 miles off the island where we harvest to over 20 miles off the island where we harvest, or with seismic activity, no harvesting occurring for the bowhead whale, or increased safety issues because the whales become very agitated with the seismic activity around us. All of these issues and concerns make you attend these various meetings, but then you also suffer through watching what happens with the Exxon Valdez, and then what happened with the Gulf of Mexico with these tremendous oil spills, and you find out that there's dispersants that are being used to put in the water, and you depend upon our waters to be clean and safe for our animals that we depend upon for their oil content to feed our families, to give us the nourishment and energy that we need in our harsh environment. These very important issues are why I participated in this process. It's important to protect our way of life and the complexity of trying to monitor the safety of our animals when they have to go through so many various zones where these pre-authorizations could be used. And you know that there are chemicals that are dangerous and cause a toxic soup. You know these are not good situations for our animals to be in, and when we're dependent upon to feed our families, you worry about what's going to happen if we harvest those animals that have been in those bills, and how is it going to affect us when we feed our families? These are questions we ask on a daily basis. We live where the risks are of the adverse events, and we actively try in so many different ways to protect the health of our people, the health of our lands and waters, and the health of the animals that we depend upon to feed our families. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm so glad and grateful for you being able to join us, Rosemary, and sharing your knowledge and perspective. We can open up the line for questions from folks if anybody wants to dive in.
Hi, Rosemary. My name is Margaret Terrence. I actually met you at Just Transition. I am now a Canvas coordinator at Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And I had a question earlier when you weren't on the line about I'm also from North Dakota, from the Three Affiliated Tribes, where the Bacon oil field is. And we also have a lot of contamination. And I was just wondering, I don't know even if there's even EPA oversight here because of the sovereignty of our nations. And I guess my question is how do we organize to collaborate with the different nations that are dealing with oil effects?
The goodness of the airwaves and the connections through the internet and these different meetings. It's about connecting people, setting up events where people gather, put up your booth and your information, and then collecting those names and starting those communications. For us, we've built layers of information that we share with other organizations, nonprofit organizations that reach out to many different people about some of our issues so that we can connect through the many, many people that need to engage to affect policy and decisions in our daily lives. By working in the different ways, there's things that hold us together. We want the goodness of our families and the harvesting in our lands and waters, whether you're farmers in the south or whether you're hunters in the north. These important things bind us together, but it's about finding those unifying languages that connect and build the actions on these important issues. Once we get some opportunities to interact in these various ways, it affects the words that are being put together by others, because if we can break down some of these blinders on the national energy policy, it's a national policy. It's people who live in these areas that are having their health affected. But by communicating and educating and working together, we all want better work done to prevent the effects for us all. But we can leverage resources by working together. We might get some layers of information from North Dakota that we don't get from the Arctic, but we might get some different information from the Gulf. And when we all work together on these different things, we know what comes out of North Dakota has much more toxic chemicals and it sinks in the water and is at higher risk for those of us that harvest in the waters and depend upon these healthy environments. But we can share some of the insight and encourage areas.
It sounds like we may have lost you there, Rosemary. It was breaking up a little bit. We'll see if you can get you back on the line. Does anyone else have a question? We have time for probably one or two more. We'll see if Rosemary can join us again for the end here, and I'll open it up.
Hi, my name is Jessica Winstaffer. I work with Chickaloo Native Village in South Central Alaska, and my question, I think, is probably for Claudia. We, as a tribal government, have participated in Alaska. I forget now the acronym or even the spelled out version, but kind of like oil spill response planning for waters in Alaska. And they're very mind-numbing multi-day meetings often. And there's really not at present time room for questioning or a good place to say, hey, the plans you have in place aren't healthy for the people who live here or who are trying to clean up these spills. what do you recommend in terms of our approach to engaging in those meetings as tribal governments? And are there resources that we can use that would be effective to bring into those meetings to maybe start questioning it from the ground up in the planning process?
That is a wonderful question about the bottom-up community organizing piece of this dispersants mess. There are, as you're alluding to, regional and area plans that nest underneath this national contingency plan that provides the broad framework for how responders can engage with an oil spill. And it's really important, as you're indicating, to work those regional and local processes too, because there is still a fair amount of discretion at the local level to decide how to respond to a given situation. EPA may authorize use of these very toxic chemicals, but that doesn't necessarily force responders' hands on the ground in a particular spill incident. I am not the right person to answer that question. I would suggest that one of our clients, Cook Inlet Keeper, has a lot of contacts that are closer to those regional and area planning processes. They've directed us to some of those people as we've worked on this case, but your intuition is spot on, which is that you really have to simultaneously be raising the federal floor. In other words, some things are so dangerous that nobody should be allowed to do them anywhere, and then pressuring individual local response planning entities to do better in their particular context. So I am not a community organizer, and I don't want to speak outside of my expertise, but that half of it is really critical. And Cook Inlet Keeper, which was not founded in response to, but very much strengthened in response to the Exxon Valdez oil spill, has done this watchdogging of the oil industry ever since, and they would be a great source of information. They may even have someone on the line, I'm not sure. If so, that person should feel free to jump in.
Well, this is Jessica again, just to follow up. Thank you. Yeah, we're definitely in contact with folks at Cook Inlet Keeper as well as ACAD. Is there a website resource for pulling up some of these research papers to just highlight during these regional planning meetings that you've mentioned, regional and statewide area planning meetings that would be easy for us to just grab and go to these meetings?
The person most likely to have this information on her website, and I would just have to spend some time with the website, but you could of course do that to see how accessible it is our lead plaintiff, Ricky Ott from the ALERT project, which is a fiscally sponsored project at Earth Island Institute. And so Dr. Ott is more familiar than not just anyone in our case, but than most people in America with all of the science on the harms of dispersants and of the dispersant oil cocktail. And I don't know how much of that scientific information she has put on ALERT's website or how easy it is to find there, but I would look first at the website for the ALERT project. And if you don't find what you're looking for there, I would contact Ricky directly. She's very accessible and energetic. And in the first instance, ask her for the particular studies that would be most persuasive. And secondarily, emphasize to her how useful it would be to have this grab and go presentation on her website, because I know she aspires to make the website much more of an information repository that can be broadly useful to organizers as well as to attorneys. So for example, the ALERT website will very soon host all of the different filings in our case. That's something we might put on our clinic website as well, but people are more likely to seek it from a client that's been focused on this issue for many years. So definitely contact Ricky.
This is Chris Benson. I'm calling from Juneau. And I have a question about health effects. Did someone ask something?
Go ahead, Chris.
During the Exxon Valdez spill, I worked for Alaska Health Project, which was an occupational and environmental health organization. And we knew that a lot of the spill cleanup workers were getting sick, and a lot of them thought it was a cold, and there was some name we had, like the Exxon Valdez crud. But our occupational health specialist was thinking it might be exposure to all the diesel exhaust that was from the boats running around, or I suppose they had generators to run the hoses that were washing the oil off the beaches. But I'm wondering, it could have been the dispersants, or it could have been the oil itself. And how do you pick this stuff apart?
That's a tremendously good question, and I'll take a little whack at it, but Rosemary should also speak to this as someone with community health work experience. There are a huge host of symptoms that people experienced who had any contact with Exxon Valdez spill and response and BP Deepwater Horizon. And these things range, in different contexts, from respiratory problems to skin rashes, headaches, migraines, nausea, vomiting, vertigo, weight loss, and even loss of consciousness. As you say, there's the Exxon Valdez crud. That was sort of a local name for a certain constellation of symptoms. And then on the Gulf Coast, people called it BP syndrome. It just became so familiar that people had certain items from this menu of adverse health effects. And in environmental health, it's always incredibly difficult to disentangle the causation when people are exposed to more than one thing. And it's also hard to figure out where those things might be interacting synergistically. I talked about how oil and dispersants are each toxic, but they're actually more toxic when they're combined. And in an ideal world, that takes, prospective, controlled, long-term studies where you can exclude every single environmental variable. That's not the world in which we live. That's not the world that, the NSF funds. So we are always just sort of working from partial knowledge, but it's incredibly important to get the public and the media and the courts to pay more attention to this rich bottom-up knowledge that affected communities have. I mean, we often don't need really fancy peer-reviewed studies to tell us what's going on when there are thousands of people who are observing things and drawing reasonable causal inferences firsthand. So I'm sure that all the diesel exhaust had some health effect. The oil surely had a health effect. The dispersants surely had a health effect. I don't know that we'll ever be able to disentangle those, but it's a great question. And I would love to hear what Rosemary has to say from her own experience of working with sick responders and community members.
For me, it's about asking questions. There's going to be many that don't have answers for us. I was told there are no concerns for health related to oil and gas development, and yet they sent me 23 scientists to do a health research project on a national policy. What are for the national planning process to open up the National Petroleum Reserve? If they're going to send that many people to a small village of 500, there's a lot more coming that I don't know about. But the reality is, if you have symptoms, document it, write down what's happening around you, keep your journals, bring it in with the doctor, and share your information of when your symptoms start, when things get worse. If you can encourage community monitoring, I encourage getting the purple air samplers to help your community identify what's happening and when there are hot times when you want to increase personal protections. If you have people that are going to go and respond to this process, you want to make sure they get the education from people who live in the response process and suffer through the symptoms and getting sick, not just the people who are going to bring the fancy equipment. But you also want to know that there are going to be effects. And if you do send people out there to respond, those people are not going to be the ones that are going to be carrying on the future generations in your community. And that's the reality of what's happening around these serious events. When you put in the process to work and prevent, that's what's going to help our communities. It's not all about allowing the hundreds of train compartment units transporting this stuff that's going through these communities to be allowed to carry that many car lengths, putting in those extra restrictions that there are protections put in to protect human health along the routes of these places. But it's getting it out of the whole system as a whole. You know, we know there are things that are out there that we don't have to use such toxic substances. We know there are ways that we can do community planning and processes to reduce our nation's consumption of energy-using substances, of which this is, and promote cleaner usages that do not affect human health in the way that these do, as well as threaten the environment that we depend upon for recreation and feeding the nations around us.
Hi, everybody.
And I know
I just wanted to make one last comment to respond to people who have been talking more about that bottom-up approach. My name's Ashley again. I'm the community manager at Public Lab, which is an organization based in Louisiana. I work remotely from the Pacific Northwest, and I'm new to this role, but I know many people that have started the Public Lab out of the BP oil spill in the Gulf. It was community-led, and it focused on environmental justice, and I just wanted to share for people that are on the call that are asking maybe more about the community science approaches. Our website, publiclab.org, has a lot of community tools. We live as an online database and community to connect people in the country and across the world with open technologies that you can do at really cheap and in your own communities, so that you can do your own environmental monitoring, so that you don't have to just rely always on these giant protection agencies, but actually take accountability, much like what Rosemary and them have been sharing with us today. So if that's a resource, I just wanted to put it out there again, publiclab.org for people.
Ashley, thank you so much. That's incredible.
Could I piggyback on that also? This is Betsy Oliver from the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, and we were formed to represent the citizens who were impacted by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And we have, sounds like there's a lot of folks interested in learning more about dispersants. On our website, we have significant information about dispersants, including a spreadsheet with almost 1,500 peer-reviewed scientific studies about dispersants, and then some information digesting all of those. So if folks are interested in that as a resource, that's at our website, pwsrcac.org, and there's a search tool you can use to find our resources on dispersants. Hopefully that's helpful to people as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Betsy and Ashley and Chris and everyone who's been bringing these questions and sharing these perspectives and resources. I'll try to compile a list from those websites that you guys provided and include it in a follow-up email to this call. We've reached the end of the hour. The call has been recorded, and so there'll be a link to that along with Claudia's slides. So if you can also review the dialogue too. I want to thank all of you for participating today, and I'm really grateful for having both Claudia Polsky and Rosemary Ahtuangaruak on the line. And for this discussion too. Our next call in May will be at the end of the month, and we'll be joined by journalist and author and co-founder of U.S. Right to Know, Stacey Malkin, who will be sharing with us about her ongoing work to eliminate toxic chemicals from personal care products. And finally, I hope you'll consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics to support our monthly Che Alaska calls. These sorts of contributions help provide the support we need to continue bringing you these calls each and every month. and you can give it online at www.akaction.org. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. You can reach us at our office here at 907-222-7714, as well as my email, nick.r@akaction.org. And yeah, thanks again to everyone for your time. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.